Terry Colath. I'm here today with Professor Adrian Kehr, and we're looking at Session 4 of the History of the United States to 1815, our next offering in our patriotic survey this summer. And this is the one where we start with George Washington's strategy, Adrian.
Yes, Terry, it's good to be back. George Washington, being the only man with significant experience militarily during the French and Indian War, was unanimously appointed as Commander-in-Chief. And given the difficult task of not having the colonies being overtaken, and as Hancock said, when they presented the declaration to him, he looked at those around him and he said, he realized that if we are caught, that we'll be tried and convicted and executed as terrorists. And they all went,
Exactly.
they'd have been hung. So this was a major, major risk for them.
And he was the only one with military
He was the only one of significant military experience. And he was a commanding presence. He was 6'1½". So he looked the part. But he didn't have an army. So he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the army. And there wasn't an army. It was a loose confederation of militia who had fought the French and Indian War, each of them run by their own colony. Each with their own particular focus, and of course most of them had real jobs. They were fishermen, they were lawyers, they were customs officials, they had real farmers, they had to go home.
Almost like the National Guard.
It's even less organized than the National Guard in the sense that they had to go home and look after the farm. And so although he had of huge numbers of people, 250,000 people to draw on, he never had more than a fraction of that to actually do any fighting because they were constantly rotating. The Brits, of course, had the biggest army in the world and the biggest navy in the world, and it was a pretty one-sided affair, it appeared. But there were mitigating factors which made it not so one-sided. One is that it's a long way from London to New York, and 4 or 5 weeks to supply, and the cost of supply was significant. We all know how expensive and how long it takes to run a war in Iraq, for instance. Yeah. So that took a long time to build up, and of course Britain had many, many, many other interests going on in the world. It wasn't just the colonies. There was the Caribbean, which is much more valuable. Jamaica and Barbados each produced more wealth than all of the colonies put together.
Really?
So the colonies were important politically, but they weren't that important economically. They were much more interesting pieces of real estate. India, eventually Hong Kong, China. So Britain had this dream of world conquest, of which the colonies were only part of that. They could not devote the whole of their war machine to dealing with these naughty patriots. And so the battles commenced, and it was a very one-sided affair. All the major cities were taken by the Royal Navy and held, with the exception of Boston. The war started in New York, and George Washington, being a newcomer, hadn't read the book and being slightly facetious, and it never split your forces, but he split his forces. He left some in across the river and put some in what is Manhattan, and the British took advantage of that, and he almost was caught. He's defeated, and he got across the Hudson just by the skin of his teeth, and the Brits were too busy consolidating New York to actually chase him. Looking back on, they should have pursued him, captured him, and the war would have come to a quick end. But he got across the Hudson and he went into retreat, but fought back in the famous crossing of the Delaware that winter, and that gave the army and the politicians some hope that they could actually they could avoid defeat. Philadelphia fell, which is rather embarrassing. That was the capital, and he moved out to winter in Valley Forge, which is a wonderful opportunity if you ever go to Valley Forge. And that was the nadir of his existence, because people were going back home. They gave up the fight. He didn't have enough food, didn't have enough ammunition. But he was able to bring his forces to a peak during that winter of training with help from France and Germany, because they were the traditional enemies of Britain. Anybody who's fighting Britain gets my vote. So you have great leaders helping out. And so he comes out of that winter much stronger than he went in. But it's looking pretty bleak. The war moves to the south, and so it all depends on can the British hold on to Charleston and Baltimore and the major cities up and down the coast, which they do. But of course, that's not going to do the job, and so we have Cornwallis being sent to actually chase down Washington and the other army commanders and bring this war to a close. They'd had a major setback in the north where Johnny Burgoyne had foolishly spent too much time in Ticonderoga and Saratoga area, and he was surrounded by a very enterprising army of the colonies, and he surrendered his army. So that was the first poke in the eye. It was really important politically because the French at that point thought maybe we can make political capital out of this war, and they started to support the colonies. And we'll come back to the impact that had on their finances later on. So things were looking pretty bleak. There was a failure after failure after failure on the colonial side, until Cornwallis made a terrible, terrible blunder. Instead of going to Charleston to be resupplied by the Royal Navy, he went to a place called Yorktown, which was almost unheard of, and he camped there and asked for the Royal Navy to supply him. Just at that very time, the French came to their peak, and their Navy held off the Royal Navy and stopped the Royal Navy supplying Cornwallis. Critical. And so he had to surrender. And the war on the ground appeared to take a new position. Nobody in England and nobody in America thought after Yorktown this is the end of the war, because it's just Burgoyne had lost 10,000 troops, Cornwallis had lost 8,000 troops, but that was just a drop in the bucket. England could send over another army or two, but for the fact that somebody has to pay for it. And the British population said, this is going to go on forever. This is a foreign war. We're not getting anything out of it. It's taking too long, and we have to pay for it. And so it's like our view of Afghanistan today. How long does it go on for, and do we have to pay for this? Only a much bigger investment. And so it was that the British Parliament said, this could go on too long, it's costing us too much, we've got other interests, let's just have a peace. And the Treaty of Paris took place, and a peace was agreed, and so it was that the colonies got independence and recognized by the British government.
Interesting. So we've come to the Treaty of Paris. We have one more session to go. Hope you'll join us for the next session too.